The dust of Redemption Creek settled in layers, each one. A memory of a gunshot, a scream, a forgotten prayer. Today it tasted of gunpowder and finality. Elias Thorne stood over the body of a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, his face. A pale, surprised mask under the unforgiving Arizona sun. The town's only bank, its windows shattered like broken promises, loomed behind him, a monument to a foolish and fatal ambition. 3 dead. 2 of the boy's partners sprawled in the street, and the boy himself, his life leaking into the thirsty dirt at Elias's feet. Elias, a man whose life had been a long, weary negotiation with violence, felt no triumph. He was a retired U.S. Marshal, a title that felt like a brand on his soul. And he had come to this forgotten corner of the world, seeking silence. But silence was a currency the West rarely traded in. He had answered the sheriff's panicked call out of a sense of duty he could no longer justify, but couldn't yet shake. His movements were stiff as he knelt his joints, protesting like old hinges. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the boy's lifeless form, not for clues, but with a sorrow so profound it was almost a physical weight. Another life squandered for a few sacks of coin. Then he saw it. Clutched in the boy's cooling hand, half hidden by dust and blood, was a glint of silver. Elias's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful snag. With a hand that trembled slightly, he pried the boy's fingers open. Lying in the dead palm was a small, heart-shaped locket, tarnished and dented, but unmistakably familiar. Engraved on its surface were 2 intertwined vines. The world dissolved into a dizzying roar. The sun, the dust, the bodies in the street, they all vanished, replaced by the memory of a summer evening years ago. He was standing on the porch of his own small ranch, a world away from this desolation. He remembered the weight of this exact locket in his own hand, warm from his pocket. He remembered placing it in his wife's palm, her skin soft against his calloused fingers. "It's beautiful," Elias Sarah had whispered, her smile radiant enough to light the coming dusk. "But what's it for?" "It's so you always have a piece of my heart with you." He'd said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "Even when I'm gone." Her laugh was like music. "You're not going anywhere." But he had, and then she had. The memory shattered and the harsh reality of Redemption Creek crashed back in. The locket in his hand was cold, a dead piece of metal that had no right to exist here in the hand of a dead outlaw. How it made no sense. It was an impossibility that mocked the very foundations of his grief. He had buried his Sarah with that locket clasped in her hands. He had seen it with his own eyes. This had to be a copy, a cruel coincidence designed by a god with a twisted sense of humor. Yet as he turned it over, he saw the tiny, almost invisible scratch near the clasp of the one he'd made himself while trying to fix the hinge. It was hers. A wave of nausea and rage washed over him. The connection between the sacred relic of his past and the profane violence of his present was a blasphemy he couldn't comprehend. It was as if the boy had reached back in time and desecrated his wife's grave. He squeezed the locket, the sharp edges digging into his palm, a small pain to distract from the gaping wound that had just been torn open in his chest. Just then, a sound cut through his haze, the slow, mournful tolling of a single church bell. It was a sound he had grown to dread, a constant reminder of the fragility of life in this place. It was the sound of another soul being committed to the unforgiving earth. Snapping the locket shut, he pocketed the impossible artifact and pushed himself to his feet. The bodies could wait. The dead had all the time in the world. He felt a pull toward that sound, a need to witness one more sorrow, to distract from the one raging inside him. He walked toward the cemetery on the edge of town, the red dust clinging to his boots. The sun was a merciless hammer beating the cracked earth until heat shimmered like ghosts on the horizon. Redemption Creek was a town built on desperation, its buildings clinging to life like stubborn weeds. The saloon's splintered facade drooped with exhaustion, and the general store's windows were clouded with grime. And on half the storefronts, a single freshly painted name stood out in stark black letters: S. Croft and the CO, a name that had become synonymous with the town's slow suffocation. The cemetery was a small, desolate patch of land dotted with tilting wooden crosses. A small cluster of people stood around a freshly dug grave, their shoulders slumped in the oppressive heat. As Elias approached, he saw Sheriff Brody, a man whose ambition had long been outpaced by his fear, nervously twisting his hat in his hands. He stood apart from the others, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if the answers to all his problems were buried there. They lowered her into the ground at high noon, while the desert sun blazed merciless overhead, turning the red dirt cemetery into a furnace that baked the mourner's skin, and their consciences equally raw. The coffin was a simple pine box, unadorned and hastily made. No one spoke. The only sound was the scrape of shovels against rock and dirt, a rhythm of grim finality. And beneath it, a more insistent, more desperate sound: a baby's cry. Beside the grave, on a patch of dry grass, lay a newborn swaddled in nothing more than a torn flour sack, printed with faded blue flowers. The infant screamed its tiny fists, balled its face red, and contorted with a primal grief that no one there seemed willing to acknowledge. The townsfolk, their faces grim and shuddered, kept their distance. They looked at the grave, at the sky, at their own feet, anywhere but at the child. She was an orphan, the daughter of Martha, a woman who had owned a small patch of land, with a working well, a woman who had stubbornly refused to sell to Silas Croft. Now she was dead, and her child was an inconvenience, a living symbol of a shame the town wanted to bury as quickly as her mother. The scrape of moccasins on hardpan made every head turn. At the cemetery gate stood a figure as still and timeless as the surrounding mesas. Chenoa Blackfeather, a woman of the nearby tribe, whose people had watched generations of settlers come and go, observed the scene with dark, unblinking eyes. She was not a part of their world, yet she understood it better than they did. Her gaze swept over the fearful faces, the averted eyes, the helpless sheriff, and finally rested on the crying child. It was a look of calculating patience, the look of a predator deciding whether a herd was worth saving from its own cowardice. Elias felt her eyes on him as well, and it was a heavier weight than the judgment of the entire town. The service, if it could be called, that ended abruptly. The preacher mumbled a final perfunctory prayer, and the small crowd dissolved, hurrying away, as if fleeing the scene of a crime. They left the gravediggers to their work and the baby to her fate. Sheriff Brody made to follow them, but Elias stepped into his path. The sheriff, a man who seemed to be perpetually sweating, flinched. "What happens to the child?" Brody Elias's voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. Brody swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the baby. The church'll see to it. Padre Miguel, he'll find a place for her. Maybe. Her mother, well, Martha, she made enemies. People are hesitant. He was referring, of course, to the one enemy that mattered, Silas Croft. Elias saw the lie for what it was, an excuse wrapped in cowardice. He saw the future of this child, passed from one reluctant hand to another, an unwanted burden, until she was old enough to be sent to an orphanage 100 miles away. Her name and her history erased. He saw his own life, empty and silent, stretching out before him like the endless desert. An old hollowed-out man haunted by ghosts. He looked from the sheriff's weak, apologetic face to the screaming infant by the grave. Her cries were not a nuisance. They were a demand for life, for comfort, for a reason to go on. In her raw, unfiltered desperation, he saw a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever. Without another word, he walked to the grave. The gravediggers paused, their shovels held midair. Elias knelt, his knees cracking in protest, and gently scooped the baby into his arms. She was so small, her weight almost nothing against the heavy bulk of his coat. As he lifted her, her cries subsided into a soft, questioning whimper. She opened her eyes dark and impossibly deep, and looked up at him. In that moment, the world narrowed to the space between his weathered face and her new one. He felt a connection so fierce and unexpected, it stole his breath. This was not a burden. This was an anchor. "I'll take her," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. He looked at Brody, whose mouth hung open in disbelief. "She needs a name." He thought of the darkness that had consumed his own life, the despair that had been his constant companion since Sarah's death. And then he looked at the small, warm life in his arms. "Her name is Hope." As he turned to leave, Chenoa. Black Feather stepped forward from the gate, her movements silent and fluid. She stopped before him, her gaze falling on the baby nestled against his chest. Her expression was unreadable, her face a mask of ancient wisdom. "Be careful, Marshal," she said, her voice quiet but resonant, carrying on the dry air. She had not called him that in years. The desert does not forget the blood it has drunk. Sooner or later, it demands a reckoning. She looked at the infant. That child carries the ghost of a debt. Elias held the baby tighter. He didn't know what she meant, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever debt this child carried, he would pay it for her. It was the first thing that had made sense all day. It was the first thing that had made sense in years. Elias's ranch was a lonely outpost of resilience, a small cabin, and a sturdy barn set against a backdrop of towering red rock formations. It was a place he had chosen for its silence, a place to let his past fade into the dust. Now that silence was filled with the tiny, demanding sounds of a new life. The first few days were a clumsy dance of trial and error. He traded his last good saddle blanket for a goat from a neighboring homesteader to get fresh milk, which he painstakingly fed to Hope with a clean strip of leather soaked in a bowl. He fashioned a crib from an old packing crate, lining it with his softest shirts. He was a man accustomed to the cold logic of a firearm and the unyielding rules of the trail. The tender, unpredictable needs of a baby were a foreign language he struggled to learn. He would sit for hours by the makeshift crib, watching her sleep, his large, scarred hands looking monstrously out of place as he gently rocked the crate. In the quiet moments when she would grasp his finger with her impossibly small hand, he felt a fissure in the wall of ice that had encased his heart for so long. He was terrified. And for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt alive. The locket remained in his pocket, a cold, heavy weight against his thigh. He would take it out at night, turning it over and over in the flickering lamplight, the mystery of it a dull throb in the back of his mind. How did a dead bank robber come to possess his wife's most precious memento? It was a question that tied the violence he was trying to escape directly to the new life he was trying to protect. His fragile peace was shattered on the third evening. The sun had just begun its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Elias was outside mending a fence post, while Hope slept soundly inside the cabin. He heard the sound of approaching horses long before he saw them, the confident, unhurried gait of men who didn't expect trouble. 2 riders crested the ridge. They were not cowboys or prospectors. They wore dark dusters and low-brimmed hats, and the way they sat their saddles spoke of a casual brutality. They reined in a few yards from the cabin, their eyes scanning the small homestead with undisguised contempt. Elias recognized them as men he'd seen flanking Silas Croft in town. Thorne, the taller one, called out, his voice a lazy drawl that didn't quite mask its menace. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed inches from Elias's boot. "Mr. Croft sends his regards. He heard you took in some stray baggage." Elias straightened up slowly, resting his hand on the fence post. He didn't reach for the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. That would be their signal. He remained still, a mountain of quiet resolve. "I'm caring for a child," he said, his voice level. "That's all." The second man, shorter and stockier, chuckled. "That's where you're wrong. That land her mother was squatting on was supposed to be Mr. Croft's. That makes the kid a loose end. And Mr. Croft don't like loose ends." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. They weren't here to talk. They were here to deliver a message to remind him of the order of things in Redemption Creek. "The land and the child are under my protection," Elias stated simply. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. The tall man's eyes narrowed. "That's a damn shame. Mr. Croft was hoping you'd be reasonable. He admires a man of your history. But he can't have a former marshal interfering in local business." He swung down from his horse, his duster parting to reveal the butt of a Schofield revolver. His partner remained mounted, his hand resting casually on his own weapon. They intended to intimidate, perhaps rough him up and ransack the cabin to drive the point home. Elias knew this dance. He had led it 100 times. Trouble finds a man, whether he's looking for it or not, he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You found yours. Ride out." The man on the ground laughed a harsh, grating sound. Getting awful brave for an old man playing nursemaid. He took a step forward. "We'll just take a look inside, make sure the property's in good order before Mr. Croft takes possession." That was the line. Elias moved with a speed that defied his age and his weary demeanor. He didn't draw his gun. That would lead to a shootout, and the sound could wake the baby. Instead, he closed the distance in 2 long strides. The thug, surprised by the sudden aggression, fumbled for his pistol. He was too slow. Elias's left hand shot out, grabbing the man's gun hand and twisting it with brutal efficiency. There was a sickening crack of bone. The man screamed, his revolver clattering to the ground. Before he could recover, Elias's right fist, a hammer forged by years of hard living, connected with his jaw. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled into a heap. The rider, startled, yanked his own gun from its holster. But Elias was already moving, scooping up a heavy length of firewood from a pile near the cabin door. In a single fluid motion, he hurled it. The log spun end over end, striking the horse in the flank. The animal shrieked in pain and fear, rearing violently. The rider, caught off balance, was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on the unforgiving ground with a grunt of pain. He lay there, the wind knocked out of him, gasping like a fish on a riverbank. Elias stood over the first man, his chest heaving, the cold fire of battle reignited in his veins. He picked up the fallen Schofield and walked to the second man, who was just beginning to stir. He pressed the barrel of the gun against the man's forehead. "Go back to Croft." Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "Tell him this is his one and only warning. Tell him the next time he sends dogs, I'll send them back in pieces." He pulled the man to his feet, shoved him toward his panicked horse, and watched as he scrambled into the saddle. The man grabbed the reins of his unconscious partner's mount and fled, not once looking back. Elias stood there until the sound of their hoofbeats faded into nothing, the silence of the desert rushing back in to fill the void. The adrenaline receded, leaving behind a familiar bitter taste. He had tried to bury that part of himself, the part that met violence with greater, more efficient violence. But Croft had dug it up. He looked at his hands, still tingling from the fight. Then he went inside. Hope was still asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm, oblivious to the brutality that had just unfolded outside her door. He knew then that this was only the beginning. Croft wouldn't be deterred by two beaten men. He would escalate. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about power, and Elias had just challenged it. Looking at the sleeping child, he understood that he couldn't just defend. He had to attack. He had to find out why Martha had been silenced, and he had a grim suspicion that her death was no accident. The ghost of a debt Shanoa had called it. The debt was coming due. The next morning, under a sky the color of washed-out denim, Elias rode into town, Hope bundled securely in a sling against his chest. He left his horse at the livery and walked to the small office of Dr. Adams, the town's only physician. It was a cramped, cluttered space that smelled of carbolic acid and stale pipe tobacco. Dr. Adams was a man in his late 50s, with a kind, anxious face and spectacles that were perpetually sliding down his nose. He looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting from surprise to outright fear when he saw Elias. "Marshal?" "Thorne," he stammered, quickly correcting himself. "What can I do for you?" "It's about Martha Elias," said his voice quiet so as not to disturb the sleeping infant. "The woman they buried yesterday. You signed the death certificate." The doctor's anxiety intensified. He began to polish his glasses with a handkerchief, a nervous tic Elias had seen 1,000 times in men trying to hide something. "I did. A terrible tragedy. Snakebite. A rattler by the look of the puncture wounds on her ankle. It happens." "It does," Elias agreed, his gaze steady. "But Martha lived on that plot her whole life. She knew how to watch for snakes. It seems careless." Dr. Adams avoided his eyes, busying himself with rearranging a stack of medical journals. "Grief can make a person careless, Elias. She was a young woman, all alone with a new baby." "I need you to look again," Doc Elias pressed his tone gentle but firm. "At your notes, at your memory. Was there anything else? Anything that didn't feel right?" The doctor stopped fidgeting. He looked at the baby on Elias's chest, then back at Elias's unyielding face. He let out a long, weary sigh, the fight draining out of him. He was a decent man, trapped in a town that punished decency. "All right," he whispered, gesturing for Elias to follow him into the small examination room at the back. He pulled out a worn, leather-bound ledger and flipped through the pages. I noted the 2 puncture marks, and the swelling, the discoloration. It was all consistent with a snakebite. But he hesitated, his finger tracing a line of spidery script. There was something else. A faint, sweet smell on her breath, almost like almonds. I noted it, but I dismissed it. The body does strange things after death. Almonds. Elias repeated, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He knew that smell. It was the calling card of a certain kind of poison, one that mimicked the effects of venom if administered carefully. And the puncture marks, could they have been made by something else? A needle, maybe. Dr. Adams looked horrified, the implication dawning on him. Good heavens. I suppose it's possible. They were very clean. I thought it was odd, but... Sheriff Brody was in a hurry to close the case. He said the town didn't need any more trouble. "The town is drowning in trouble, Doc. It's just learned to call it business," Elias said grimly. "Croft wanted her land." The doctor sank onto a stool, his face pale. I didn't want to believe it. But Martha was the 3rd homesteader to die in an accident this year. All of them on land Croft wanted. He looked up at Elias, his eyes pleading. "What can I do? Croft owns everything. The sheriff, the bank. If I speak up, I'll be ruined. Or worse." "You've done enough," Elias said, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. "Just keep this between us for now." Elias left the doctor's office with the confirmation he'd expected, but dreaded. Martha was murdered. Now he needed proof that would stand up, proof that couldn't be buried by a corrupt sheriff and a powerful land baron. He needed to go to the source. He found Chenoa by the creek on the edge of town, where she was gathering herbs, her movements as patient and deliberate as time itself. She looked up as he approached, her expression betraying no surprise. The doctor confirmed it, Elias told her without preamble. Martha was poisoned. Chenoa nodded slowly, placing a bundle of sage into her basket. A man like Silas Croft does not ask for what he wants. He takes it, and he buries what stands in his way. She straightened up, her dark eyes meeting his. Her spirit is not at rest. It lingers at her home. It waits for justice. Together, they rode out to Martha's cabin. It was a small, sad-looking structure already showing signs of neglect. The door hung ajar, and the wind whispered through the empty windows. Elias left Hope with Chenoa at the edge of the property, the baby now awake and cooing softly in the native woman's arms. Inside the cabin was a scene of quiet desperation. A single room sparsely furnished. A simple bed, a rough-hewn table, and an empty cradle in the corner. It was clear Martha had been preparing for her child's arrival. Elias felt like an intruder, a profiler of ghosts. He searched methodically, his martial training taking over. He checked the pantry, the mattress, the cold ashes in the hearth. Nothing. He would have sent his men to clear it out, he muttered, frustration mounting. Anything incriminating would be long gone. Men like that look for things of value. Chenoa's voice came from the doorway. Gold, money, deeds. They do not look for a mother's secrets. Her gaze drifted to the floor, to a single plank near the hearth that was a slightly different shade than the others. Elias followed her line of sight. He knelt and pried at the edge with his knife. The board came loose with a soft groan. Beneath it, nestled in a hollowed-out space, was a small oilskin-wrapped package. His heart quickened. He carefully lifted it out and unwrapped it. Inside was a slim ledger, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. It wasn't just a record of farm expenses. It was a diary of corruption. Martha had been keeping meticulous notes. She had detailed every visit from Croft's men, every threat, every suspiciously low offer for her land. She had recorded the stories she'd heard from other homesteaders, a pattern of intimidation and fear. And on the last few pages, she documented the accidents: a rancher's barn burning down, a prospector's wagon, losing a wheel at the edge of a canyon, a farmer found drowned in a shallow creek. Her name was the last one on the list, written in a shaky hand, dated the day before she died. Beside it, she had written a single word: poison. This was it. The proof he needed. Croft's entire criminal enterprise laid bare in the hand of his last victim. As they rode back toward town, Elias felt a grim sense of purpose. But his victory was short-lived. As they neared Redemption Creek, they saw a plume of smoke rising against the evening sky. It was coming from the direction of the doctor's office. Elias spurred his horse, a terrible premonition gripping him. The office was engulfed in flames. A crowd had gathered, their faces lit by the ghastly orange glow, watching with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Sheriff Brody was there, shouting ineffective orders to a pathetic bucket brigade. "What happened?" Elias demanded, striding up to the sheriff. Brody jumped, his face slick with sweat and soot. "An accident, Thorne." "A lamp overturned," the doctor. He was trapped inside. Elias stared into the heart of the inferno, the ledger in his saddlebag suddenly feeling as heavy as a gravestone. This was no accident. This was Croft tying up another loose end. Dr. Adams, the one man who could corroborate his suspicions, was dead. And now Croft knew that Elias was investigating. He had been a step ahead of them the entire time. Worse, Croft had been busy while Elias was gone. He had been turning the town against him. Elias could feel it in the suspicious glances and whispered comments from the crowd. He was no longer just an outsider. He was a threat, a man stirring up trouble that the town desperately wanted to ignore. He had the truth in his hands, but in a town run by fear, the truth was a dangerous and unwelcome currency. With the ledger secured in his coat, Elias walked a path he knew well, the one leading to the predator's den. He left Hope in the care of Chenoa, who had promised to keep her safe in the hidden canyons outside of town, until this was over. His stride was long and purposeful. As he crossed the main street of Redemption Creek, the setting sun casting his shadow like a lance before him. The townsfolk scattered from his path, their fear a palpable thing. Silas Croft's office was on the second floor of the new hotel, the only two-story building in town, and another monument to his ambition. It was a world away from the dust and grit of the street below. The carpets were thick, the furniture was polished mahogany, and the air smelled of expensive cigars and leather. Croft was standing by the large window looking down on the town as if it were his personal kingdom. He was a man whose elegance was a weapon. Dressed in a tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, he looked more like a senator from back east than a frontier land baron. He turned as Elias entered, a slow, charming smile spreading across his face. It was a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice as smooth as aged whiskey. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I trust you're not here to complain about the quality of our local fire department. A tragedy, the good doctor. Such a clumsy man." Elias didn't waste time with pleasantries. He walked to the desk and slapped the oilskin-wrapped ledger down on the polished surface. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "Martha's diary," Elias said, his voice flat. "She kept a detailed account of your business practices. Extortion, arson, murder." Croft's smile didn't waver. He picked up the ledger, his movements unhurried, and idly flipped through the pages. Impressive penmanship. A shame she won't be writing any more sequels. He tossed the book back onto the desk. This proves nothing. The desperate scribblings of a woman who foolishly resisted progress. No court would take this seriously. "I'm not a court," Elias said, stepping closer. "And you're right. This isn't for them. It's for you and me." Croft finally let the charming facade drop. His smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold, serpentine amusement. He walked around the desk until he was standing just a few feet from Elias, the air between them crackling with tension. "You still don't remember me, do you, Marshal?" He said, his voice a low, contemptuous purr. He tilted his head, allowing the evening light from the window to catch a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline. "El Paso. 15 years ago. A bank robbery not unlike the one that dirtied your hands the other day. You and your partner Dawkins came in with guns blazing. Heroes of the West. The papers called you." The memory hit Elias like a physical blow. El Paso. A botched robbery, a bloody shootout that had spilled out into the street. Civilians caught in the crossfire. A man, a woman, and their young son cut down by stray bullets. It was the single greatest failure of his career, a nightmare that had haunted him for years. You were hailed as heroes for stopping a gang of killers. Croft continued, his voice dripping with venom. But you never saw the collateral damage, did you? You never saw the man who watched his wife and child die on a dusty street because a U.S. Marshal was too eager to pull the trigger. You just cleaned your guns, collected your commendation, and moved on to the next town. He tapped the scar on his temple. A stray bullet from a hero's gun gave me this little souvenir. It didn't kill me. It just gave me a new purpose. The truth settled over Elias, cold and heavy. This wasn't about land. It was never about land. This was a meticulously crafted revenge 15 years in the making. My name isn't Croft, the man said, a cruel sneer twisting his lips. It's Silas Blackwood. You took my family, Marshal. So I came here to this forgotten piece of hell to take yours. I bought this town, I broke its spirit, and I intended to grind it into dust. I wanted you to watch as everything you thought you were protecting withered and died around you. He gestured toward the ledger. That woman and her land were just pieces on the board. But you taking that child, that was a gift I never anticipated. His eyes gleamed with a fanatic light. Now I get to watch you lose something you love all over again. I will burn this town to the ground with you and that baby in it. An eye for an eye, Marshal. A family for a family. The conflict had been reframed. It was no longer a fight for a town's soul. It was a war between two ghosts, born from the same tragic moment in a dusty El Paso street. And Redemption Creek was their battlefield. Before Elias could react, the office door burst open. Sheriff Brody stood there, flanked by two of Croft's brutish thugs. The sheriff held a piece of paper in his trembling hand. Elias Thorne Brody stammered, his eyes refusing to meet Elias's. I have a warrant for your arrest. For the murder of Dr. Adams. Croft let out a soft, triumphant laugh. You see, Marshal? I've learned a few things over the years. Justice, Marshal, is a matter of perspective. You delivered yours from the barrel of a gun. I prefer a more permanent kind of investment. It was a perfect trap. The doctor, his only witness, was dead. Croft had likely paid someone to set the fire and then testify they'd seen Elias leaving the scene. The ledger was now just the word of a fugitive against that of the most powerful man in the territory. Elias knew he had only seconds. He kicked the heavy mahogany desk with all his strength. It slid forward, slamming into Croft and Brody, sending them stumbling backward. As the two thugs raised their pistols, Elias dove through the large plate glass window. He hit the balcony outside with a jarring thud and the sound of shattering glass echoing behind him. Gunshots erupted from the office, splintering the wooden railing near his head. He didn't hesitate. He swung himself over the side, hung for a moment, and dropped to the street below, landing hard but rolling to absorb the impact. He came up running, a fugitive in the town he had tried to save. He was alone, framed for murder with the full weight of Croft's power and the corrupted law bearing down on him. His only thought was of hope. He had to get to her. He had to get to Chenoa. He melted into the shadows of the alleyways, the town he had entered as a reluctant hero, now a hunting ground where he was the prey. He ran under the cloak of a gathering twilight, every shadow a potential enemy, every sound a threat. He made it to the livery stables, saddled his horse with frantic, practiced hands, and rode out of Redemption Creek, the shouts of a forming posse fading behind him. He was now an outlaw, a ghost on the run, branded by a past he couldn't escape and a future that had suddenly become terrifyingly uncertain. He found Chenoa and hope deep within the winding labyrinthine canyons that were the ancient home of her people. It was a place the white man's law could not easily penetrate, a sanctuary of soaring rock walls and hidden springs. Chenoa had a small fire going in a sheltered alcove, the flames casting dancing shadows on the stone. Hope was asleep in her arms, safe and warm. The sight of them, an island of peace in his sea of chaos, settled the frantic beating of his heart. He explained everything: Croft's true identity, the frame-up, his escape. Chenoa listened without interruption, her face impassive in the firelight. When he finished, she simply nodded. "The past is not a river that flows away," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It is a circle. It always returns. This man, this Silas Blackwood, is bound to you by blood and fire. The circle must be closed. He won't stop until I'm dead and the town is ash." Elias said, his voice raw with exhaustion and fury. "I can't keep running, not with hope." "You will not," Chenoa stated. "The hunter cannot see the trap when he believes he is chasing his prey. You must turn the tables. You must choose the ground where the circle will end." She looked up at the sky, where dark, heavy clouds were beginning to gather on the horizon, obscuring the stars. "A storm is coming. For him and for you. You must use it." They spent the next day hidden in the canyons. Elias felt the weight of his isolation pressing down on him. He was a man who had always represented the law, who had lived by its rigid code. Now he was outside of it, a wanted man with no one to turn to, but an old friend who spoke in riddles, and a baby who represented everything he had to lose. As the day wore on, the wind began to pick up, whining through the narrow canyons, carrying the taste of dust and the promise of a reckoning. Chenoa's words echoed in his mind. You must choose the ground. He couldn't fight Croft's army of hired guns and his bought and paid for law out in the open. He needed to isolate him, to strip away his power and face him as a man. There was only one place to do it, a place that served as the dark heart of the town's Fear the Saloon. He formulated a plan, a desperate gamble. He gave Chenoa a message to deliver, a challenge for a final meeting, man to man. She slipped away into the dusk, a silent shadow moving through the landscape, leaving Elias alone with hope and his thoughts. He held the sleeping child, her warmth a fragile shield against the cold dread that threatened to consume him. He was no longer fighting for justice or for the town. He was fighting for her, for the flicker of a future she represented. By the time Chenoa returned, the storm had broken. It was not a rainstorm, but a tempest of wind and sand. The sky turned a sickening shade of brownish yellow as the desert rose up to reclaim the world. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the cabin and rattling the very foundations of the earth. Visibility dropped to near zero. It was the perfect cover. He will be there, Chenoa said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. He brought the sheriff and 2 of his men. His pride will not let him refuse your challenge. Elias handed hope to her. Keep her safe, no matter what happens. Chenoa met his gaze, her dark eyes filled with a deep, ancient understanding. The path to peace is sometimes through the heart of the storm. Go close the circle. Elias stepped out into the raging sandstorm. The wind tore at him, stinging his face with grit. He pulled his hat down low and wrapped a bandana over his mouth and nose, moving through the maelstrom like a phantom. The town was deserted, its streets scoured clean by the gale. The only light came from the grand saloon, its windows glowing like malevolent eyes in the swirling chaos. He entered through the back, silent as a ghost. The saloon was an island of eerie calm in the heart of the storm. Dust filtered through the cracks in the walls, coating everything in a fine red powder. A single lantern hanging from the ceiling swung back and forth in the drafts, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed and danced like specters. The only sound, apart from the muffled howl of the wind, was the loud, rhythmic ticking of a large clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow, counting down the final seconds of a 15-year feud. Silas Croft Blackwood stood at the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Sheriff Brody was huddled near the door, looking pale and terrified. Two of Croft's thugs stood on either side of the room, their hands hovering over their guns. They all turned as Elias stepped out of the shadows. Thorncroft said, his voice laced with triumph, "Punctual. I appreciate that in a man on his way to his own execution." "It's over, Blackwood," Elias said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in the swirling tide of chaos. He held his hands away from his gun, showing he wasn't there for a simple shootout. This was something else. "Oh, it's far from over," Croft sneered. "But it will be soon." He savored his whiskey, then set the glass down with a deliberate click. "Before we conclude our business, I feel I owe you one final piece of the truth. A parting gift, you might say." He walked toward Elias, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "You've carried the guilt for what happened in El Paso all these years, haven't you, Marshal? The weight of my family's blood on your soul? It must have been a heavy burden." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But what if I told you that you've been carrying another man's sin?" Elias remained silent, his face an unreadable mask. "I was there," Croft continued, his voice trembling with resurrected rage. "I was wounded lying in the street, but I was conscious. I saw everything. It wasn't your bullet that killed my wife and son, Marshal. I saw the man who fired. It was your partner, Dawkins." The name hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. Dawkins. His partner, a man he'd never fully trusted, a man known for his quick temper and his love of bribes. He was a degenerate and a coward, Croft spat. He took bribes from the very gang we were supposed to be stopping. When the shooting started, he panicked. He fired wildly into the crowd. I saw his face, Marshal. He saw me see him. But you were the hero. You took the outlaws down. It was so much easier for everyone, including the Marshal Service, to let the blame for the civilian deaths be a tragic, anonymous consequence of the crossfire. So you carried the guilt, while he carried the sin. The revelation settled in the dusty air, a truth more devastating than any bullet. The guilt that had defined Elias's life, the ghost that had driven him into self-imposed exile, was a lie. He had been a scapegoat, a vessel for another man's crime. Croft saw the flicker of confusion and anguish in Elias's eyes and pressed his advantage. He slid a gleaming revolver down the length of the bar. It stopped a few feet from Elias. "The law failed us both that day," Marshal Croft said, his voice seductively reasonable. "It protected the guilty and punished the innocent. And it fails us now." He gestured with his chin toward the trembling Sheriff Brody. "Look at him. That is your law. A coward in a tin badge bought and paid for. He's a symbol of a system that let my family die and let you live in torment." He offered Elias the ultimate choice, the final temptation. "So I offer you a new kind of justice. My kind. Pick up that gun. Shoot the sheriff. Avenge us both. Avenge the very idea of justice. Do that and you and the child can ride out of here. My men will not stop you. It will be my final gift to the man who has suffered for a crime he did not commit." The clock on the wall ticked. The lantern swung. The wind howled. Elias stood at a crossroads, caught between a past built on a lie and a future that depended on the choice he made in the next second. Kill the symbol of the broken law and embrace the path of pure vengeance, or find another way. Elias looked at the gleaming pistol on the bar, then at the terrified face of Sheriff Brody. He saw the glint of steel in the hands of Croft's men, ready to fire at the slightest provocation. And he saw Silas Croft, a man so consumed by his own pain that he wanted to burn the world down around him. He saw his own reflection in Croft's burning eyes, a man defined by loss, a man who had let violence be his only answer. For 15 years, he had been a prisoner of the past, but in the last few days, he had held the future in his arms. Her name was Hope. Slowly, Elias shook his head. "No," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound clarity that cut through the storm's howl. He looked directly at Croft. "Justice isn't revenge, Blackwood. And I'm done paying for other men's sins, especially yours." The moment stretched taut and fragile. Then all hell broke loose. But it was not the hell Croft had envisioned. Elias moved. He didn't reach for the gun on the bar. Instead, he kicked the leg of a nearby table, sending it crashing into the gunman on his left. In the same motion, he grabbed a heavy glass beer stein from the bar and hurled it at the swinging lantern. The glass shattered, plunging the room into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint, dust-filtered light from the windows. Gunshots exploded in the dark, deafening and chaotic. But Elias was already a ghost moving through the blackness, with a certainty born of 1,000 desperate fights. He heard one of Croft's men cry out as he tripped over the fallen table. Elias closed the distance, a silent shadow. There was the sound of a heavy thud, and the man was silent. The second gunman fired again, the muzzle flash, momentarily illuminating the room and giving away his position. It was all Elias needed. He dove, tackling the man at the knees. They hit the floor in a tangle of limbs. Elias used his skill not to kill, but to disable. A sharp, precise strike to the man's wrist, and his gun clattered away across the floorboards. Another to his temple, and he went limp. Now it was just him and Croft in the dark. "You can't hide forever." Thorncroft roared, his voice unhinged. "You can't escape what you are." "I'm not hiding." Elias's voice came from a direction Croft didn't expect. He had circled around him in the blackness. Before Croft could turn, Elias was on him. The fight was short, brutal, and intimate. It wasn't a gunfight. It was a struggle of pure will. Croft was strong, fueled by years of rage. But Elias was stronger, fueled by a desperate need to protect the future. He disarmed Croft, twisting the pistol from his hand, and slammed him back against the bar. Just as he did, the storm outside began to subside. The wind's scream softened to a mournful sigh. A sliver of moonlight, pale and watery, cut through the dusty window, illuminating the scene. Elias stood over a defeated Silas Croft, holding the man's own gun. Sheriff Brody, who had been cowering behind an overturned card table, slowly rose to his feet. He looked at the two unconscious thugs, at the disarmed and broken man at the bar, and then at Elias. He saw a man who had possessed the skill to kill them all, but had deliberately chosen not to. He saw a man who had upheld a law that had forsaken him. In that moment, Sheriff Brody found something he thought he had lost long ago: his courage. He drew his own pistol, his hand surprisingly steady, and pointed it at Croft. Silas Blackwood Brody said, his voice clear and firm for the first time in years, "You are under arrest for the murder of Dr. Adams and Martha Collins." The saloon doors creaked open. Chenoa stood there, a silent sentinel. In her arms, wrapped warmly against the lingering chill of the storm, was Hope, awake and watching the scene with wide, innocent eyes. Chenoa's presence was not a surprise, but an affirmation, a silent testament to the choice Elias had made. The circle was closed. In the days that followed, Redemption Creek began to breathe again. The arrival of a squad of U.S. Marshals summoned by a telegram from a newly resolute Sheriff Brody formalized the end of Silas Croft's reign. The ledger, now in the hands of federal authorities, was undeniable proof. Croft, his face a mask of cold, impotent fury, was taken away in chains to stand trial, not just for his crimes in Arizona, but for his part in the long-forgotten sins of El Paso. The truth about Dawkins Elias's corrupt partner came out as well, a posthumous stain on a tarnished badge. The stolen land deeds were recovered from Croft's safe, and one by one the homesteaders who had been cheated or intimidated found their property restored. A cautious optimism began to seep back into the town, like rain into the parched earth. Elias, cleared of all charges, became a quiet fixture in the town's recovery. But his most important work took place not in the sheriff's office or the town hall, but in the small, sun-drenched office of the circuit judge. With Sheriff Brody and Chenoa as his witnesses, he went through the legal process of formally adopting the infant he had rescued from the edge of a grave. He gave her his name. She was Hope Thorne now. A week later, as the sun began, its slow descent painting the sky in soft hues of rose and gold, Elias walked to the cemetery. Hope was nestled in a sling against his chest, her soft breaths a gentle rhythm against his heart. The air was clean washed by the storm, and the world felt quiet and new. He stood for a long time before two graves. One was old and weathered, the resting place of his wife Sarah. The other was new, a simple wooden cross marking the grave of Martha Collins. Two women he had never been able to protect, two mothers whose legacies now rested with him. He spoke to them in a low voice, the words meant only for them and the quiet land. He told Sarah about hope, about the impossible locket that had somehow found its way back to him, a mysterious bridge between his past and his present. He told Martha that her daughter was safe, that she would be loved, and that her courage had not been in vain. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his old worn U.S. Marshal's badge. The silver was tarnished, the edges smooth from years of use. It was a symbol of the man. He had been a man of unbending law, of violence, and lonely justice, a man haunted by a guilt that was never his to carry. He polished it one last time on his sleeve, the metal catching the last rays of the setting sun. With a final gentle breath, he knelt and placed the badge on the red earth right in the space between the two graves. It was an offering, a surrender, a burial. He was letting go of the marshal, the enforcer, the ghost. He was embracing the Father. As he stood, he saw Chenoa approaching, her moccasins making no sound on the hard pan. She stopped beside him and looked from the badge on the ground to the sleeping baby on his chest. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small, smoothly carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. For her crib, Chenoa said, her voice soft. So she remembers how to fly. Elias took the small totem, its wooden surface warm and smooth beneath his fingers. He looked at Chenoa, a silent gratitude passing between them that needed no words. He looked down at Hope, her face peaceful in sleep, and then out at the vast desert horizon, now bathed in the gentle, forgiving light of dusk. The ghosts of his past were finally silent. His long, violent war was over. He had found his redemption not in the barrel of a gun, but in the weight of a child in his arms.